Can you all see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me back up here. So the title of my talk is Digitally Disadvantaged Languages and Machine Translation, Mapping the Challenges, Promises, and Perils. And Marwa, you did a great job of introducing me, so I think I'm just going to skip that slide. And I will just say that I am speaking to you all today from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So I'm very pleased to be here. I know it's morning where some of you are, and then it's evening here. And it's very nice to be connected through this virtual platform, I have to say, with people from so many places. So the aims of my presentation today are to really contextualize machine translation as a phenomenon that is shaped by power, and it's in a context of digital technologies, language hierarchies, and translation, which in and of themselves are also all shaped by power. And I want to kind of hone in on how machine translation fits into these kind of systems of power, which can shed some light on that for those of you who are interested in this field. Digital systems affect the lives of speaker communities. And I also want to shed light on the challenges, promises, and perils of MT technologies for digitally disadvantaged languages and their speaker communities in particular. So you probably all have some degree of awareness in terms of language hierarchies in the world, and in terms of, you know, the number of speakers, the sizes of languages that we have, and then how that maps onto the digital sphere. And so we see kind of interesting incongruities between the way, you know, the kind of place that languages have in the real world versus online. We see, for example, Chinese being the largest language with first language speakers, 1.2 billion, followed by Spanish, and then English, and then Hindi, Arabic, etc. Whereas when we look online, we see that English content makes up, you know, a very large portion of the world, and then you know, other languages make up some portion, but not necessarily an equivalent portion as to what we see offline. And we see kind of, you know, these are just a few examples. You know, Daniel Prado in 2015 pointing out that the famous search engine Google only recognizes one African language and no Indigenous American or Pacific languages, while simultaneously supporting 30 European languages. And we start to see how, you know, power is affecting which languages get supported and which are left out, as well as histories in terms of where these technologies come from, who developed them, you know, the markets for these technologies, etc. And then we have this quote from Tim Berners-Lee reminding us one thing I think is very important. You know, the web does not just connect machines, it connects people. And I think we always have to keep that in mind when we're looking at new technologies. So what are the politics of language technology? Langdon Winner is a communication scholar I like to refer back to, and he asked the question, can artifacts have politics? You know, we have this kind of sense that maybe tools could be used for good or evil, but other than that, you know, how does the tool in itself kind of shape power and who is able to do things and who is not able to? And you see this picture of a park bench here, and I often bring this as an example, and I ask people, you know, why do you think there's an armrest in the middle of this park bench? Well, the answer is that it prevents homeless people from sleeping on the bench. So while this bench is designed to give, you know, passersby a nice rest, maybe they could eat their lunch there, it allows that, but it doesn't allow people to actually use this as a bed. And so this is kind of a very tangible example of how the design of technologies allow certain things and make other possibilities impossible or very difficult. And we can kind of compare that to our digital sphere. And we see, for example, big tech companies presenting themselves with very kind of techno-optimistic, kind of tech evangelistic mission statements, such as Facebook, claiming to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together, very global. And I actually brought you Facebook's first ad to kind of help us reflect on this. Whoops. See if it works. Oh no. Okay, well, I don't want to take time. I'm sorry the video is not working. It was working on my end, but for some reason with Zoom, maybe it's not working. If you have a chance, I'll drop, oh, here it comes. Okay, shares are like Facebook.
Chairs. Chairs are made so that people can sit down and take a break. Anyone can sit on a chair, and if the chair is large enough, they can sit down together and tell jokes, or make up stories, or just listen. Chairs are for people, and that is why chairs are like Facebook.
So Facebook is using this metaphor of a chair as something very universal, very neutral. It's bringing the whole world together, and in fact, I think we see around 60% of the world's population on Facebook today, which is quite remarkable. But when we think about languages, we see that not everyone is able to use Facebook in the same way and at the same capacity. My work really focuses on how many languages still lack digital supports, especially those written in non-Latin scripts. And we have people like the computational linguist Andras Kornai concluding that 95% of languages will not attain digital vitality. Mark Davis, former Unicode president, stating that 98% of languages are digitally disadvantaged. And we start to see these kind of power dynamics where the chair isn't necessarily for everyone. So before we go further, I want to kind of define some basic terms and distinctions. So globally, there are 6,000 to 8,000 languages. And, why is that such a murky number, you might ask, right? Well, the reason is because there's not a clear distinction between a language and a dialect in many cases. And there's this famous quote that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, right? So again, power helps determine even which ways of communicating are deemed languages. And we should also remember that most people in the world are bilingual or multilingual, and we see 23 languages spoken by more than 50% of the global population, and 96% of languages spoken by 4% of the global population. So a lot of languages spoken by a very few people and a few languages spoken by many. Now, scripts are the ways that we write languages, made up of the characters that we use to write them. And there are about 300 scripts. And it's important also to note that languages and scripts do not have a one-to-one or a static relationship. So I included a picture here from Azerbaijan. It has gone through script shift multiple times in the 20th century, from Cyrillic to Arabic, back to Cyrillic to Latin script. And these scripts also coexist in the same spaces and in the same conversation, well, not conversations, but written conversations potentially. And we also need to remember that many languages do not have writing systems. They're called oral languages. And even those that do, we may say, we estimate, Ethnologue estimates that 57% of languages have a writing system. In many cases, it is not actually widely used. Now, linguists have been raising alarm bells for a little over 2 decades now about drastic rates of language extinction. And their predictions range from 50 to 90% of our languages will go extinct this century. Now that's quite shocking rates. And this map gives you a sense of where the kind of endangered language is highly at risk, and also language extinction is taking place. You can see it's a global phenomenon, but at the same time, it's kind of, there are clusters of places where this is happening. And scripts are also being abandoned as well as emerging. There are a number of new scripts being developed over time. And in particular, we see with script shift, changes to the Latin script or the new adoption for oral languages of Latin writing systems. So why is this happening? Well, we have histories of colonization and empire that have brought language shift with them, and also writing system and shifts in writing. We see histories of evangelization and the spread of religions and religious texts. We see logics of alphabetic superiority, as well as the power of Western countries. So countries wanting to adopt a script that would be closer to English or closer to Western Europe to kind of create new allegiances. We see urbanization. People, be it because of climate or ecosystem changes, economic challenges, moving to urban centers and not being able to pass down their mother tongues to their children. And we have histories of oppression. We have many cases of genocides of minority language speakers. We have many cases where young people are taken and put in boarding schools and are physically beaten for speaking their mother tongues. And these have all contributed to these patterns of language shift and extinction. And as a communication scholar, my question was, how does digital technology play into this? Since digital technology has such an imbalance of support for many of these same languages that have been oppressed and disadvantaged in other realms. Now you might say, well, why should we care? Really, I mean, this is inevitable, some say. Maybe it's a good thing if we all speak the same languages, or a few languages. Well, in fact, research shows that for language communities, the loss of a language often means loss of intergenerational cohesion. There are many young people around the world who cannot communicate with their grandparents. Loss of culture and well-being. We see high rates of suicide, high rates of economic challenges and other challenges that are linked back to really drastic changes that come along with language extinction. And then on the other hand, for all of us as a whole humankind, we need to acknowledge that there's more, despite what Google might tell us, right? There's more knowledge stored in people's memories, even than that which is stored in books, let alone our databases. And so we're seeing with extinction of language, a great extinction of ideas, ways of knowing, wisdom, and potentially solutions for future problems. So how does language extinction map onto the digital sphere? Well, when a language is not supported digitally, what happens is that people lose function in that language. Let's say, here in Ethiopia, let's have an Amharic speaker, and it's not easy for me to write an email in Amharic, so I also know English, so I'll write my email in English. But then we also see loss of prestige. So especially for young people, when they don't see their language in the digital sphere or well supported, that's a very clear message that their language is not as important, as cool, as useful. They may have a sense that it doesn't really have a place in this modern age that we live in. And then last, we see a degradation of competence, again, especially for young people as they're gaining language ability. If they're not able to use their language when they're texting with their friends, for example, they may lose literacy and fluency in their language, and they may actually, eventually not put the attention in to actually learn their language fully. And so these things actually contribute not only to digital extinction in the digital sphere, but actually to shifts in real life, as they say, right? Of course, we know digital is real life. Here we are all on Zoom, right? These are very interconnected spheres. So what would it mean to actually support all of our languages, right? Well, computer scientists call this full stack support. And this basically means you have foundational level all the way to the top. And I want to kind of contextualize where machine translation fits into all of this. So first you have Unicode support. This is very basic. It just means that the characters in your writing system are digitally supported. They can be interoperably exchanged between major platforms, software, and devices. Currently, Unicode supports 154 scripts, but there's still 150 more that are unencoded. And next, you need a font, right? Because for your script to actually appear, it has to have some visual form called a font, and then you need a keyboard or input, a way to actually, tell your device the characters that you want to use. And then you need support in major software platforms and operating systems. So this would be like, Google, maybe Facebook, maybe Microsoft Office, maybe you want to use an Apple computer. Does your operating system work in your language? And then above that are these NLP tools, so natural language processing. And this is where you have things like spell checkers, autocorrect, voice recognition, and machine translation. And here I put this example, this is kind of right, The Simpsons, this idea of how would you possibly have a Mandarin, Chinese keyboard? Well, did you know that because of advances in NLP technology, it's now faster to type in Chinese than it is in English? So we shouldn't say that, the non-alphabetic scripts or scripts with many characters can't be supported digitally. That is actually a falsehood. We can support all the different writing systems and languages. It just takes some, engineering and ingenuity. So when we think about NLP, we're in this realm, right? The way that NLP considers, and again, these language hierarchies, the way it sets up a hierarchy with languages based on resources. So at the high end of the hierarchy are high resource languages. They have hundreds of millions of documents online, large labeled data sets, large Wikipedia, and this is English, French, Chinese, many of your major world languages. And most of our NLP research to date has been focused on these languages. Next, you have medium resource languages, few labeled data, millions to hundred thousands of online data documents, some parallel data, medium-sized Wikipedias, and this would be most European languages as well as some large official languages. And this may by chance include languages that would otherwise be low resource, but are of strategic interest to the military or intelligence of large wealthy countries. So if they want to spy on people who speak these languages, they might actually develop translation tools and other NLP tools for these languages. As well as some that have had really strong grassroots support. So there is a place for people to get involved and, help build tools for a language that they speak or that they're interested in. And then third on the list is our low resource. This is the widest part of our pyramid. No labeled data, few data online, small or no Wikipedia, and this is most languages in the world. And it even includes languages spoken by tens of millions of people, such as Amharic, Xhosa, Bengali, until recently, actually it's moved up to medium resource as well as Zulu. So we see these hierarchies of power and wealth mapped onto the digital sphere. If we dig down a little deeper into our low resource, or what I call digitally disadvantaged languages, there's still some more distinctions. We have our impoverished low resource languages with very few written resources, be it digital or print. Even though they may still be have large communities of speaker, they may not have descriptive grammars or lexicons. Usually the children are not learning in these languages, and an example would be the Mixtec family of languages. And then we have standard LRLs. They may have descriptive grammars, they may have parallel data sets, often based on, especially including Bible translation. And they may have some orthography and pedagogical materials because they may be taught in schools, broadcast on radios and TV, but there are very few NLP resources. So Kurmanji, Somali, Swahili are examples. So I wanted to share a couple examples. One is Tamazika. I know we have at least one participant from Morocco. It's very high on the EGIDS rating. This is what linguists use to measure the vitality of languages. So it's actually a national language of Morocco, used in education, work, mass media, and government. But nonetheless, there is no Wikipedia. Kornai classifies this language as digitally dead, and as of 2017, there's only one parallel Amharic English corpus. Second example is Mandinka. It has official status in Senegal and Gambia. It's not endangered. It has an EGIDS of 5, which means there's intergenerational communication and a positive attitude. However, it's a primarily oral language with less than 1% literacy, no Wikipedia articles, And, Kornai points out, for example, that languages without mature writing systems are unlikely to digitally ascend because machine translation depends so much on these large data sets of written material. So what are the challenges we see for these digitally disadvantaged languages when it comes to machine translation? Well, we have lack of corpora or data sets. Lack of basic digital supports means that it's difficult for people to develop those natural online corpora like Wikipedia or Twitter. We often have a community or cultural disconnect with things like Wikipedia. And because people are multilingual, they might just as well look up something on Wikipedia in English rather than developing their mother tongue Wikipedia. We have a lack of NLP skills within these language communities because often coding requires English. We have a lack of funding for digital language equity initiatives and a lack of focus on these languages within major NLP research centers. And at times, if researchers want to work on these languages, they may not have access to language experts to consult with on these languages. So what are the promises on the other hand? The good news is there is a role for even individuals or small groups to develop a baseline of digital support for a language. And if this exists, there is a chance to develop community-based language corpora through things like Twitter or Wikipedia. We also see NLP innovations potentially playing a role in for these languages. Historically, statistical machine translation worked better for these languages than neural machine translation, which is the most cutting edge approach. But recent innovations in NMT show that we can transfer learning about high resource languages onto low resource languages, especially if they share syntax or morphology. So for example, if you wanted to build a tool for Catalan, you could learn from Spanish and would help move your work forward more quickly without as much of a data set. And then our promise kind of verges into utopian visions, and we have to be careful of, again, these kind of tech optimism, but again, simultaneous, universal, ubiquitous translation systems. Imagine us all wearing a little Google Glass. Maybe we can speak our mother tongue. We don't care about learning a lingua franca like English or French or Spanish anymore because everything would automatically be translated. It would be the golden age of language diversity again. Well, that would be great, right? But and maybe it would help with translation in conflict situations, help people get health information, and close a digital divide. Now,
Isabelle, just sorry to interrupt, but could you just wrap up your presentation, please?
Yes, I think I have 2 slides left, so it's sure. So in terms of peril, unfortunately, as we've seen, digitally disadvantaged languages may go extinct before the promise of machine translation actually arrives. Now, again, not all language communities want machine translation. Its development has been compared to colonial extraction of language. At times, the translation quality may be poor and of little use to the speaker community. And because machine translation can make these languages more legible to surveillance, so corporate government, INGO, and in turn may reinforce systems of oppression afflicting these communities, such as minoritized, indigenous, and migrant communities. So we see, for example, machine translation and surveillance being used at the borders, for example, at the US-Mexico border, to surveil communications of migrants and may affect their asylum case. So I hope I have met the aims of my presentation. But more importantly, I hope I've inspired all of you to think about what would language justice in machine translation look like and what can we help do to achieve that. So I'd like to thank all the images that I used and cite. I'm happy to share my bibliography with people. If you would email me, I can send that to you. And I'm open to comments. And I'd just like to thank artist Abel Tillehun for the use of his artworks, and for all those who have helped me with my research over the years.
Thank you, Isabelle, for such an insightful presentation about language policy, endangered languages. That was really interesting, and it had some really interesting information. I would like to mention something that we should have mentioned earlier. Dear attendees and everyone, we mentioned before that we will be supporting French interpretation for the 3 days, but due to some technical problems, we apologize for not providing French interpretation today, and it will be available, it will be provided tomorrow, the third day of the conference. So apologies for everyone. And now back to you, Isabelle, again. So now it's a Q&A. If you have any question, you can write them, you can post them using the Q&A feature or just raise your hand. We already have a question for you, Isabelle, and it's from Renee. She says, merci, Isabelle, for a thought-provoking and comprehensive presentation. My own work has tackled some of these issues, particularly translation and social media. Interesting to note, it took Instagram 7 years to support right-to-left languages like Hebrew and Farsi. While I largely agree with what you have presented, I will play a sort of devil's advocate. If we look at some social movements that were digital born, like Le Printemps, Irable, and Idle No More, some found ways to circumvent lack of language support to create their own language communities beyond machine translation, which focused on revitalization, e.g. self-translation, crowdsourced translation. What are your thoughts on the role of social media, social movements to push programming and platform support change?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. A very thought-provoking question, and I actually thank you for sharing some examples that I'll have to look into more. I'm not familiar with these two, the Printemps Érable and the Idle No More campaign, so I will look into those. But I would absolutely agree with you that it's very possible for language communities to work on digital vitality without machine translation. I actually think machine translation, although it is at times sold as something that the language communities can use, and it can be useful, it's not necessarily, I feel that it's often, it's a tool that is, often developed for outside communities to, do business with a language community or to surveil that language community. So I'm not necessarily presenting it as the kind of solution to language vitality. But I do absolutely agree with you that social media and social movements are a major way that language communities can push forward programming and platform support change. And it's also a way that they can raise the prestige of their language in the digital sphere and kind of raise visibility about wanting to use their language in digital spaces. But absolutely, I mean, I think these, the big tech companies, they are, they can be impacted by kind of social pressure, and they don't like to look bad in the media because they like to present themselves as serving the whole world. So I think it can be, an effective way to pressure them. And furthermore, when those companies, for them to say, we're going to spend money to support a language, they often want to see that that language has, use online. So if there's a movement to use, a language, that can help also create kind of a logic in which it makes more sense to support a language by the big tech companies.
Thank you, Isabelle, for your answer for this question and for answering Renee. So let me check if there are other questions or someone raising their hands.
Hi, sorry. That was really interesting. I didn't think the justice or equality of machine translation. But I also have a question. So you said right now Google's recognize or supports 30 European languages, of which are minor languages as well. But do you really think power is the only reason to explain this phenomena, or because the languages that are used by less people relatively and machine translation is hasn't built a enough database or a linguistic system to support such languages. And also my second language is that you mentioned, right now, like computers can support all languages, and you take Chinese, for example. My mother tongue is Chinese, actually. So because I know for Chinese, we have a Latin written form for the pronunciation. That's why we can type Chinese on the keyboards. So do you know any other, what if other languages do not have such a form for language users to type on their keyboard? How machine can cope with this situation? That'd be my questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hyun Ying, for the two interesting questions. So the first question, yes, you're right. I mean, to say that, I mean, power is a very broad term, right? So how do we can't just explain everything through power and just end it at there, right? That there's a lot that you have to unpack in terms of what you mean by that. But with that slide and the quote from 2015 talking about the languages that Google supports, you know, I also mentioned that there is the role of the history of these technologies. UK and US were the first to develop digital technologies, for example. And so because they had that, you know, kind of first move advantage, they were designing tools for their own use. So they first designed them to support numbers and then the Latin script. And the first kind of character encoding was ASCII, which was just supporting the basic letters and characters that American English uses. And then there was expansions and work in different parts of the world in parallel to start supporting other characters. So we have history as a major part of this, and we also have markets, right? Who is paying for these technologies, right? If we think of Google, largely supported by advertisements, right? Which are the markets that are, you know, generating enough funds to make it worthwhile to support those languages. We have national governments that play a role in this as well, because they do a lot of work to support their own languages and scripts, which then can be incorporated into other tools. So there's a lot of pieces there. Now, you're right that, you know, for example, oral languages that don't have those written texts, they don't create kind of a foundation from which to build these NLP tools. That is a barrier. Where you can't, I mean, I wouldn't say that you just blame the companies or you just blame, you know, any particular entity for this kind of these hierarchies of sort of support. But it is something with enough, you know, enough focus and enough money and investment that can be overcome. Even for those oral languages, there are ways to convert oral corpora into a written form that can then be turned into machine translation that could then spit back out oral translations for people who don't read and write. So it is work that can be done, but the question is there, you know, who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? So I do think power is still, I mean, again, as a broad term, is important within the structure. Now, in the second question, in terms of the keyboards, you're right. I am, you know, I have some familiarity with the kind of input methods for Mandarin Chinese. There are different, one you describe as Latin keyboard, where the Latin characters convert into, the computer system converts it into a Chinese character. And then there's also, like on mobile devices, kind of stroke systems, right? Where you use a stroke, and then there's a kind of a prediction of the most likely character that you are inputting, and then you can maybe choose between a few possibilities, right? And this has actually become very, very fast as compared to, you know, us still with our kind of QWERTY keyboard trying to push in all those little tiny buttons on our smartphones, right? So there's many ways to develop keyboards for different scripts in different languages. Some can use a Latin based and then convert it, and that may be quickest for people who are already familiar with the Latin script. But then there's stroke based kinds of input systems and swipe based input systems. I mean, there's there's and then there's like, you know, voice recognition input systems, right? So there's a lot that can continue to be done for innovations in this area.
Thank you, Isabelle, so much for answering these questions and for your presentation. So please, attendees, if you have any questions for Isabelle, because we have a couple of questions there, so you can email Isabelle directly. We put her email on the screen and you can find it. So go ahead, and I think she would welcome like answering your questions. So thank you, Isabelle, again.